Well, I hope that, I don't know, inviting a talk about economics and looking for positive outlooks is maybe a bit of a far-fetched idea, but we hope to hear very much good outcomes that came from some of the tragedies in Europe in the middle of the 14th century. Thank you so much, Tamar, and for Beit Avichai for this lecture series. For anyone who has been with us and would like a reminder, or who hasn't met us before, this is indeed the third in a four-part lecture series, which is all lectures by members of the ERC group headed by Professor Elisheva Baumgarten, Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe. Last week, we heard some of the reactions to the horrific number of dead people, to the terrible loss that there was during the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. And we heard two extremes of human reactions to the loss that was around them. One was new ways of managing dead bodies, new institutionalized groups that took care of dead bodies for the Jewish society. And the other reaction was dancing in the face of death. Dancing is a reaction to the tragedies of death, and dancing maybe as a way to avail it. This week, we're going to be talking with Nureet, Dermer, and with Aviya Doron about economics. And for me, one of the interesting things, kind of hearing their preparation for the talk, was that they're going to be talking together. Aviya and Nureet are going to be presenting one with the other. And the other is that they're going to be talking about both change and continuity. So they're going to be talking about the ways that the Black Death affected Jewish and Christian relations, specifically economic relations, showing that on the one hand, some of the deeply ingrained economic dynamics which were around in medieval Europe were completely changed by the events of the Black Death. And on the other hand, some really deeply ingrained which continued on despite the huge social and economic changes that took over all over Europe. And they're going to be focusing on two medieval cities. One is Paris and the other is Frankfurt on the Main. And I will present both of them together in order that you can have an idea of who's going to be talking to you. And after about a 40-minute presentation, we're going to be taking questions. As you listen to their presentations, as questions come up, please do write in the chat any questions that you have. We'll collect the questions and pose them to the panel about a quarter of an hour before 6 o'clock. And to introduce you to our wonderful two speakers today, Aviya Doron is a PhD candidate and member of the Beyond the Elite group, and her PhD advisor is Professor Elisheva Baumgarten, the group's head and leader. And she's writing her PhD at the Hebrew University in the Department of Jewish History. And her focus is about risk and trust between Jews and Christians in the various types of economic interactions which they had in Germany in the Middle Ages. Now, we're going to be we try along the program to be as surprising as possible. So one of the things which both Aviya and Nureet have are surprising background professions. Aviya was for 15 years a pianist, and she holds a BA from the Jerusalem Academy of Music. And despite that, she's going to be talking about economics. And she finished her MA with honors in 2017 in European Studies at the Hebrew University as well. And Nureet Dermer, likewise, is a PhD candidate being directed by Professor Elisheva Baumgarten in the Department of Jewish History at the Hebrew University. Nureet spent 10 years being a certified accountant, and she holds a degree in economics and accountancy from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She finished her MA in Jewish Studies. That's where she made the shift between today's economics and medieval economics. And she's working on a PhD about the socio-economic relations during the 14th centuries in northern France. And interestingly, she looks at points in between times of change and hardship. So she's looking at the daily life, which is what we're all interested in the group. So I'm passing the microphone on to Nureet and to Aviya, and looking forward very, very much to hear what you're going to tell us about continuity and change in Jewish-Christian economic interactions in Paris and in Frankfurt on the Main in the 14th century. Thank you both.
Thank you, Neta, and thank you, Beit Avichai, for this wonderful opportunity to share some aspects of our research. Welcome, everyone. I am Nureet Dermer, and together with my colleague Aviya Doron, we are going to examine some socioeconomic aspects of the Black Death We're going to do this by looking into the specific example of economic interactions between Jews and Christians. Before delving into our topic, it is worth mentioning that many of the questions we ask ourselves regarding the 14th century are in fact questions that we ask ourselves today, facing the COVID-19 pandemic. Here are just a few examples from recent journals that I'm sure you've all come across in one way or another during the last couple of months. And indeed, the sense of catastrophe or economic apocalypse is not unique to our days. The question we chose to deal with today concentrate on the concept of economic rupture. We seek to understand whether a global pandemic necessarily means a restart of the economy. We will further examine how economic activities recover from such dramatic shocks. With all this in mind, we will see how examining society and economy in the long run help us crystallize the balance between continuity and rupture. So let us now dive into the 14th century. The 14th century endured several major crises. France, for example, as did other Western European regions, went through famine, war, and 2 outbreaks of the Black Death. We can also attest to political unrest within cities all over Europe that contributed to the continuous instability of the 14th century. From the Jewish point of view, the French Jews also endured 3 expulsions from the French lands. And finally, we know that violent pogroms and local expulsions were also prevalent. The plague was by no means the only crisis that happened during the 14th century. And surely it was not the only crisis that had economic repercussions. It was perhaps the most dramatic global event. The tendency to look at the plague as a great shock is not surprising, nor is it a new matter. Chronicles from the 14th century indicate that to some extent it was seen as if the end of the world was coming. Apocalyptic views spread throughout the world, and the economic and legal institutions were described as practically gone. Here is one example from the 14th century French chronicler Jean de Venette, who describes the arrival of the plague to Paris as an eyewitness. Now, I will just note that most of the texts that we bring today were translated by us for the purpose of this talk from either German, Latin, or French. In the month of August, 1348, when the sun was beginning to set, a big and very bright star appeared above Paris, toward the west. At length, when the night had come, this big star, to the amazement of all of us who were watching, broke into many different rays, and as it shed these rays over Paris toward the east, totally disappeared. It was a presage of the amazing pestilence to come. Let's now read another source that points to the perception of the plague as a large-scale crisis that had caused not only severe mortality, but also economic and social implications. This source indicates that the world, in fact, went through an apocalypse, socially, legally, and economically. This is the example from Italy. In this sore affliction and misery of our city, the reverent authority of the laws, both human and divine, was all in a manner dissolved and fallen into decay, for lack of the ministers and executors thereof, who, like other men, were all either dead or sick or else left so destitute of followers that they were unable to exercise any office. Wherefore, everyone had license to do whatsoever pleased him. While indeed, according to different estimations, around 33% of European population had vanished as a result of the first and second outbreak of the plague, and of course, there were severe economic ramifications for this health crisis. Today, we would like to ask, did the plague mark the end of previous economic interactions between Jews and Christians? We will ask whether it was a catalyst of major critical economic change, and we'll try to answer these questions by looking at the case of Jewish-Christian economic relationship throughout the century. We would like to see the large larger context of the plague and the economic implications. Specifically, we will tackle these questions through the prism of foreignness, exploring whether Jews were considered foreigners in medieval cities and how did that impact their economic activities. So here is our roadmap for today. I will return to you later, but at this point, I turn the mic to Aviya, who will situate us in the economic scene of the 14th century. Please, Aviya.
Thank you, Nureet, and thank you, Neta and Beit Avichai, for hosting this wonderful event. So before looking at the economic response to the plague, let us first talk shortly about the 14th century economy. Looking at the economy of Europe as a whole, similar to today, it was a relatively globalized economy. Of course, that is in 14th century terms. Much of the economy was dependent on interregional trade and commercial relations, which were long established since the major economic growth of the late 11th century, what is called the Commercial Revolution. As you can see in this map depicting 14th century trade routes, the economy relied on a system of interconnected routes that spanned across Europe and beyond into North Africa and Asia. These trade routes crisscrossed and met at commercial depots, such as markets and fairs, which served as hubs for interregional economic exchange. In this map, you can see not only the trade routes, but also the commodities that came from each region, showing only the most representative commodities for each of these regions and the dependency of different areas in Europe on interregional trade for supplying their daily sustenance. Once the plague hit, many of these connections started to unravel. The plague, besides great mortality, also resulted in people limiting their movements, maybe not a big surprise, limiting their movements between cities and reducing consumption. Beyond the immediate reduction in interregional trade, locally, less population led to less working hands, less demand for food supplies, which interfered in the system of land ownership, eventually causing the value of properties to plummet. Furthermore, and also in some ways similar to today, these immediate shocks resulted in bankruptcies and increased debt, and different types of loan forgiveness became very common. Above all, on a more human level, the great mortality rates also meant that long-established economic ties and business relationships simply vanished. Nonetheless, just as we are witnessing today, it is not surprising that economic interactions persisted during and also resumed after the Black Death. And as Nureet presented before, we'd like to review together today to what extent perceptions of Jews as foreigners in economic contexts were shaped by the Black Death. Looking at the question of foreignness allows us to view the connection and intersection of economy and society, and how Jews fit in the larger processes that the economy underwent. At this point, we'll begin by examining the early 14th century, and I'll hand the mic over to Nureet as we'll step into the city of Paris.
Thank you, Aviya. So the 14th century saw a series of changes that threatened the fragile social and economic arrangements in European cities. Crises like the Black Death inspired sentiments and encouraged theories of blame attached to strangers and other groups. In this section, I will use economic administrative documents from about half a century before the plague in order to get a closer look at attitudes and conceptions that were manifested against Jews during the plague. Let's read this description of Jean de Venette, whom we've met earlier, who describes a well-known reaction of the Christian population to the plague. Some said that this pestilence was caused by infection of the air and waters, since there was at this time no famine nor lack of food supplies, but on the contrary, great abundance. As a result of this theory, the Jews were suddenly and violently charged with infecting wells and water and corrupting the air. The whole world rose up against them cruelly on this account. And here are just a few examples of persecutions against Jews in only one region in France, and there are many more examples like this. The archival evidence clearly point to the magnitude of such persecutions during the years of the first outbreaks of the Black Death. Nevertheless, other sources tell us that it wasn't only the Jews who suffered from this kind of behaviors. Here is a description of Guy de Chauliac. He was a famous surgeon in the 14th century from Montpellier. And this is what he writes. Many were in doubt as to the cause of this great mortality. In some quarters, it was believed the Jews had poisoned the people and thus killed them, meaning killed the Jews. In some other quarters, that it was the poor cripples and they chased them away. And others, that it was the nobles, and so they were afraid to go among the people. Finally, they went so far that they placed guards at the cities and villages and did not permit anyone to enter who was not well known. And so, unfortunately, much like today, we witness that in times of crisis, the first ones to get blamed and hurt are the minorities, among which are the Jews. This is true also when we look at the economy of the 14th century and the changes in the position or the status of the Jews within the local economy of Paris. At this point, I'm going to take us back to the beginning of the century, to the years leading to another catastrophe, the Great Expulsion of the Jews from France in 1306. I am doing so in order to examine the role of the plague in the Christian perception of the Jews as the others. So just to situate us, here is a timeline for 14th century France. There were 3 expulsions of the Jews from northern France, several years of great famine that caused great mortality and economic crisis. There was also a long, exhausting, and very expensive war against England, and a second round of the Shepherd's Crusade, while the first one was around 70 years earlier. Along this crusade, Jews were endangered and also killed. Within these events, we situate also the Black Death. I hope this is clear that the 14th century indeed suffered many major crises, and that looking at just one of these events separately might be problematic. Now we'll turn to the first set of documents that will help our query regarding the conception and attitudes towards Jews, and more precisely, their otherness. So let me introduce you to the tax lists from Paris. There are 7 tax lists spanning the years 1292 to 1313. The tax that was recorded and collected in these documents was called the taille. This tax was calculated according to the annual revenues of the inhabitants, and it's similar to the modern income tax that we pay today. The tax lists include names of taxpayers and their individual occupations, but also contain a wealth of information about people living in Paris, addresses, both street and local parishes, family ties, geographical origins, and amount of tax paid in each year. I can tell you also that each list consists of about 10,000 entries. Each entry is in fact a household. The lists were organized according to parishes and streets, and we can actually follow the track of the tax collectors because they even mentioned certain well-known landmarks, for example, monasteries, well-known crossroads, and other public locations. In each year, there was about 10,000 livres, this is the coinage, that was collected. In the Jewish perspective, Jews were included in the lists, yet separately at the end of the list. They were recorded in 3 lists, that of 1292, 1296, and 1297, and they were missing from the lists of 1298 and on. Now remember that they were still in Paris at that time, at least until 1306 when they were expelled. And it's interesting to think of their disappearance from the tax list and as we're getting closer to their expulsion. In the years they did participate in these censuses, the Jews consistently paid the tax according to their share in the overall population, meaning approximately 1.5% of the tax collected. The fact that the lists were organized by parishes and streets help us situate the inhabitants of the city on the city's map. This map, for example, is a map of 13th century Paris. It was drawn in the 19th century according to the tax lists and to other archival and archaeological evidence. If we read the tax lists, we find that the Jews did not live in a Jewish street, but in fact, they were living side by side to their Christian neighbors on the very same streets. And we can notice that they lived mainly in the central part of the city. Also, we find several families living on the bridge that connected the Ile de la Cité with the left bank of the River Seine. So on the one hand, we learned that Jews lived next door to Christians. They were not isolated. On the contrary, they lived in central locations in the city. They participated in tax burden and included in municipal administrative registers. And I can also tell you that according to the lists, they held various occupations. Therefore, we can conclude that in this respect, they belonged to the city. They were part of the fabric of society and they were seen as part of it. But then again, on the other hand, we recognize that they were still distinct. They were listed separately and moreover, they disappeared from the tax list as of 1298, although we know that they were still in Paris. And let's not forget that they were formally prohibited from participating in certain economic activities. Let's keep these tax lists in mind and the complexity they express and turn to another interesting document from that time that tells us about a different economic interaction between Jews and Christians. This is an extract from a sentence held in a Parisian court called Le Parloir. It was one of the judicial authorities in Paris, and it was in charge of the economic infringements. Now, remembering the map we saw earlier at the opening of today's talk, indeed, most of the commodities arrived in Paris through the Seine River. A certain part of the river, which flowed through Paris, was at that time monopolized by a certain merchant organization. In order to arrive to Paris, you had to be either a merchant that belonged to that organization or to pay the fee to the organization in exchange for permission to cross through Paris with your commodity. Our case concerns an interesting collaboration between two Jews, Benoit and his father-in-law, Abraham Miró, and the abbot of Saint-Denis and his people. It was a well-known, Saint-Denis was a well-established convent in the periphery of Paris at that time. So our partners tried to smuggle merchandise through the river, but they were caught and brought in front of the court. And the documents describes at full length the smuggling, the conspiracy to bring the merchandise to Paris without paying, and so on. All the time, the court mentions the collaboration of the parties, the Jews and the Christians. But then suddenly, when the verdict was given, the only ones held responsible were the Jews. The abbot and his Christian people completely disappears. Now, the reason that the court gives for this verdict is that the Jews, Abraham, Miró, and Benoit, were foreigners. You can see it here. When I first read this document, the names of the Jews sounded familiar. So I went back and looked for them at the tax list. And what I discovered there was that Abraham Miró and his son-in-law, Benoit, were not foreigners. They were well-known inhabitants of the city of Paris. They paid the taxes. And I can tell you also that there is further evidence, I did not bring it here, but there is also documents that attest that they owned a house in Paris. So the fact that the Parloir describes them as foreigners and holds them solely responsible for the economic violation is evidence to the complexity of the idea of foreigners with respect to the Jews. So let's try to conclude what we've seen thus far. The Jews were integrated in the Parisian economy. They were living in central locations alongside Christians. They paid the taxes according to their share in the overall population each year. They were known and active in municipal, economic, and legal institutions. We find them in the legal and municipal documents, but they were listed separately in the tax lists, and they were described as foreigners despite the fact that they were living in Paris. And let's not forget that finally they were expelled 3 times along the 14th century. And this all happened half a century before the Black Death, and with very close proximity to the expulsion of the Jews from France in 1306. So this can indicate that it wasn't the plague alone that played a role in the social and economic attitudes towards Jews in France. The conception of Jews as integrated in one hand, yet foreigners on the other hand, attests to the complexity of the social and economic idea of belonging and foreignness, and the changes the Jewish-Christian socioeconomic relations endured before and during times of crisis. Different perceptions and actions against Jews indeed aggravated according to particular sets of local circumstances. We can conclude that process culminating at the time of the Black Death were already underway from the beginning of the century. Their intensity was magnified during times of crisis. Now, let's move to a different city with different circumstances and see how the same question come into play there. Aviya?
Yes, sorry, just took a moment to start the screen share. And at this point, let's jump straight into Frankfurt and move about 100 years forward in time. And let us begin by examining a decision of the city council, the governing authority in the city of Frankfurt. This decision from the early 15th century deals with the ability of foreign Jews to stay in the city. And I will quote, "The council decides that the mayor will no longer allow foreign Jews who come to Frankfurt to reside in the city for more than 3 days, and instructs the local Jews not to defy the council's decree." In this decision of the city council, they attempt to restrict the ability of foreign Jews to reside in the city for longer than 3 days. This decision places a clear distinction between the local Jews, who are expected to uphold the decision of the council, and the foreign Jews, whom the council is trying to control and regulate. Interestingly, going back to the early 14th century, nearly a century earlier, we see an opinion of Alexander Zuslin HaKohen, an important halachic scholar who lived in practice in Frankfurt, who similarly addressed the question of foreigners in the city. His opinion reads, "On a market day, a foreigner is allowed to lend money to the Gentiles who come from other places to the market, but not to the residents of that city, and so on every fair." We are presented here with a statement that foreigners, not necessarily foreign Jews, were not allowed to lend money to the residents of the city, but only to other foreigners. Unlike the decree of the city council from a century later, this decision does not try to restrict foreigners' ability to stay in the city, but rather it sets the boundaries of permissible economic activity for them. Furthermore, we interestingly see that not only Jews are coming from outside the city and presented as foreigners. Rather, we get the picture that Frankfurt was a city that attracted people from outside, and that different laws and rules applied to those insiders and those who come from outside. So we should ask ourselves, why are so many foreigners coming to Frankfurt? Frankfurt was the site of one of those interregional fairs that I mentioned earlier in our opening today. That means that during specific times of year, merchants from all over Europe would flock to the Frankfurt Fair to exchange goods. In the image you see here, which is not medieval, but rather from the late 17th century, you can get a feeling of the scene created in the city during the times of one of these fairs, with many people and carts crowding the streets of the city with different merchandise. The Frankfurt Fair due to Frankfurt's favorable geographic location, was the portal for much of the international trade in Germany, or more accurately, the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire, roughly the area of modern-day Germany. Through the fair, goods from France and Italy could come into the empire and then be distributed to other cities. Let us now find our bearings in the layout of the city and also locate Jews' presence in the urban topography. This too is a later map of Frankfurt from the 16th century. Even though some of the smaller details in the map are not necessarily accurate for the 14th century reality, the general layout is very similar. So you can see here is where the Judengasse was, the Jewish street. While not all Jews of the city lived on this street, nor were Jews confined to living in any one location in the city, on the Judengasse, we would find many of the Jewish communal buildings, the synagogue, the mikveh, and so on. Many Jews also lived on this street and the alleyways that came out of it. Beyond Jewish residency, in this area was the location of the market. There was more than one market location in Frankfurt, and we know in addition to the more, let's say, general market, that there was also a specific market for cattle, a market for horses, and also one for produce. Here, you can also see the location of the St. Bartholomew Church, one of the main churches in the city. This map reveals how centrally located the Jews were in the city, both their personal residence and their communal buildings, and that they were near both the commercial and political sources of power. Their physical proximity to these sources of power also suggests their reliance on different forces in the city for their daily existence, but we'll get to that a little later on. At this point, let's take a step back and ask what actually happened to the Jews of the city during the Black Death. In the German Empire, Jews were reliant on the protection of different rulers. In the empire where the emperor did not have very strong centralized power, in many cases, sovereign authority over cities was in the hands of local or territorial rulers, whether bishops, dukes, or princes. These in turn, in most cases, also provided protection to the Jewish population residing in their territories. However, in certain towns in the empire, there was no local ruler, but they were under the direct control of the emperor, as was the case in Frankfurt. Such cities were called free imperial cities. Even though Jews were under the protection of the emperor, it was common for him to pawn out or lease his rights over the Jews to other local rulers in times of financial difficulties, to fill his own treasury. Thus, such counts, bishops, or even entire city councils who would gain rights over the Jews from the emperor could receive the lucrative income from Jews' future taxes, and in return, had to provide them with protection. An interesting example of such a transferal of rights appears on June 25th, 1349. In a document testifying to the emperor's transfer of rights over the Jewish community to the Frankfurt City Council, which, as I just explained, was a pretty standard procedure, an interesting and very unusual clause appears. There it's written that if it were, heaven forbid, that the Jews were to die, be slain, or flee the city, the emperor promises not to hold the city responsible for this and allows the burghers of Frankfurt to take possession of the goods and property left by the Jews. It is important to note that inserting such a condition did not happen in a vacuum. Rumors of well-poisoning accusations were already spreading throughout the German Empire, and attacks against the Jews had already taken place in other cities in the empire and also in other areas of Europe. Such a guarantee, as we see in this document, essentially gave the council financial security if something were to happen to the city's Jews, who were supposed to supply them with future tax revenue. Keeping this document in mind, let us now look at the timeline of how quickly events unfolded in Frankfurt and how Jews' reliance on official protection played out specifically in this city. So just a little bit of background, during the period of time in question, the emperor was in a very difficult political situation with struggles over the throne, which we won't go into today. But nonetheless, this instability had a direct impact on the fate of the Jews in the city, as you can see here with just how quickly matters unraveled in Frankfurt. The rights over the Jews were pawned in late June. Approximately 3 weeks later, the Emperor Karl IV, who was at the time actually present in Frankfurt, had to leave the city to be recrowned in Aachen, the site of all coronations of the Holy Roman Emperors. Just a week after his departure, the Jews of the city were attacked by an angry mob. Even though the city council tried to restrain the mob at first, they were unsuccessful, and the Jews of the city were massacred. As in other places in Germany, these events predated the plague's arrival to the city by several weeks. And despite these devastating events, as we will see in other places, Jews will return to the city. Considering the great significance of the Frankfurt Fair, it is not surprising that the first indication of Jews returning to the city are as foreign guests who frequent the fair. With time, along the 1350s, we will see Jews return to the city as more permanent residents. First, in 1357, we will see the first records of Jews in the imperial court records of the city, which I will explain a little bit more about momentarily. And furthermore, in 1361, we have the first record including Jews in the city real estate registry, indicating a more permanent living arrangement than the court records. And also interesting that in this registry, it is mentioned that the house that is now being bought by a Jew was previously leased by another Jew for a few years. So we get the idea that from the late 1350s, Jews returned to reside more permanently in Frankfurt. But what does their return to the city actually mean? And how does this fit in to other changes in the city's population following the Black Death? As a result of the Black Death, urban populations were hit hard, and in many cases even harder than rural locations, also like we see in today's pandemic. But since urban rulers were very much dependent on tax revenue to sustain themselves, they tried very hard to attract new people to come and reside in the cities. This was a process that began immediately after the first outbreaks of the Black Death in the 1350s. Within this more general process that was happening throughout Europe, we see that Jewish citizenship in Frankfurt changed. Rather than more communal or collective privileges, which were common before the Black Death, we will see personal citizenship agreements. These agreements were signed between the city council and a representative of any given Jewish household in exchange for a sum of money. And these agreements were time sensitive, which meant they had an expiration date, usually remaining valid for up to 10 years. And even though it was possible to renew such citizenship agreements after they reached their deadline, we can wonder, what are the consequences of such great uncertainty for people's social standing in the city and also for their future economic planning? And this created a change within the Frankfurt Jewish community that coincided with greater trends within the German Empire. And after the Black Death, there were many expulsions of Jews from other cities throughout the empire. As many Jews sought other places to live in, Frankfurt was a kind of a pit stop on the way to northern Italy. And let us ask at this point, how were Jews' economic activities in the city shaped by this increase in mobility? One indication for this can be found in the court records that I mentioned earlier. These are records created by the imperial court in Frankfurt, which had jurisdiction over all the citizens, including Jews, in the city of Frankfurt. These records contain claims that Jewish creditors, mostly Jewish creditors, brought to court, primarily following the default of their debtor. By looking at these records, it is possible to see a change in volume of economic activity. Simply looking at the number of claims brought to court each year, it is easy and very clear to see a dramatic decrease in cases in the years following the Black Death. Also, it is important to keep in mind that the numbers of cases in 1349 account for only 6 months, as the attacks against the Jews took place in July. So it took nearly 2 decades for the number of cases brought to court to reach their pre-Black Death numbers. And even then, they did not quite recuperate. And a small caveat at this point, these numbers only represent the cases brought to court and not all economic interactions between Jews and Christians in the city. However, even if we were to assume that the volume of economic transactions did return to the pre-Black Death rates much sooner than these court records indicate, it is also worthwhile to ask, what does it mean if Jews were less likely to rely on the municipal judicial system in their daily economic interactions? And how does this reflect their willingness to access and use municipal institutions? Looking at the same court records, another interesting piece of evidence that emerges is that it is possible to identify the same Christians doing business with Jews. In most cases, it won't be with the same Jews, but we can see the same individuals who before the Black Death were accustomed to having business ties with Jews, rebuilding ties with different Jews after the Black Death. Also, we see that even though these court records testify mostly to money lending transactions, as they did prior to the Black Death, the items used as security against loans are different. One very clear example is in real estate. Whereas, as you can see from these charts, before the Black Death, property was hardly used as collateral in loans. After the Black Death, the number of loans backed by real estate spiked dramatically. This is even more interesting considering, as I mentioned earlier, the entire Jewish community was more mobile after the Black Death. Yet people are increasingly turning to the most immobile form of security in their business. To come full circle with our Frankfurt foreigners, we'll end with another decision of the city council from a bit later in the 15th century than the one we opened with. This decision states that the Jews are forbidden from lending foreign money, that is money from Jews who are not citizens of the city. And moving into the 15th century, we see that not only is the city council attempting to regulate the ability of foreign Jews to remain in the city, but it is also trying to limit the economic influence foreign Jews can exert while they are present in the city. To do so, the council restricted what local Jews, those who were not considered outsiders or foreigners, were able to do in their business activities. To sum up some of the developments we saw in Frankfurt. First, mobility was not a new phenomenon in Jewish life in the Middle Ages and existed well before the Black Death. However, we can talk about different kinds of mobility, whether short-term, like merchants traveling to a certain market location, or family members traveling to relatives in order to celebrate a wedding together, or long-term mobility where people intend to resettle in a new location. Beyond the personal implication of either type of mobility, we can wonder what it meant for a community when a certain mass of it were newcomers, or that in general, the community was experiencing a constant coming and going of its members. Moving beyond the Jewish community to the urban authorities, protectionist policies existed even prior to the Black Death. But the boundaries between insiders and outsiders were further defined and regulated after the Black Death. Nonetheless, we see that despite all of these changes, the same types of economic activities persisted, albeit with some changes. So let's move up to our conclusions of the whole talk today. We saw that when examining Jewish-Christian economic relations throughout the 14th century, the plague alone did not account for the major changes that took place in the perception of Jews as members of the city's community, and for the economic implications this perception had on their daily life. Within the broader context of economic repercussions of the Black Death on urban life and economy, we see that cities underwent major population changes due to the great mortality of the plague. Thus, Jews were not the only ones who were new or foreign to the cities after the Black Death, but the entire population experienced a major upheaval. Nonetheless, against these great shocks, certain personal ties were able to endure and continued after the plague. And even more so, legal and economic institutions continued to function and were able to survive the shock of the pandemic, as well as the other shocks and crises of the 14th century. And finally, when examining the evidence from Frankfurt and Paris against each other, we saw that there were different types of foreignness and different ways to classify Jews as foreigners, at times indicating geographic location, distinguishing between local Jews and those who did not inhabit the city, and at times indicating a deeper social separation of Jews in the city. This testifies to the ways in which local circumstances and realities shaped attitudes toward Jews. Beyond the acute and catastrophic repercussions of the plague, the complexity of attitudes toward Jews in the 14th century was shaped by many additional factors. In both Paris and Frankfurt, we saw that it was political unrest and power struggles between competing elites with different interests, together with specific underlying economic conditions, as well as long-established relationship between the Jews and the ruling authorities that eventually determined the fate of the city's Jews. The result of the specific condition in each of these cities eventually produced very different outcomes for the city's Jews.
And we thought it would be fascinating to finish our talk today with the words of the sociologist and philosopher Georg Simmel on this matter of strangers and foreigners. In spite of being inorganically appended to it, the stranger is yet an organic member of the group, only we do not know how to designate the peculiar unity of this position other than by saying that it is composed of certain measures of nearness and distance. A special proportion and reciprocal tension produce the particular formal relation to the stranger.
Thank you very much, Nureet and Aviya. Thank you for your fascinating talk. I think the point with which you concluded is also a connecting thread to the different lectures which we've had. Before I make that point and latch onto your conclusions, I'd like to invite anyone who's listening to us to give us some questions in the chat. We've already collected several questions and we'd like to see if there are any more which you'd like to raise to our two speakers, and if you would like to indicate whether it's more Paris oriented in towards Nureet, or whether it's more Frankfurt oriented in towards Aviya, or either of them could answer in their turn. So the issue of strangeness, foreignness, connectedness, intersections, living amongst and living apart is something which was also raised in the background to the whole question of the Black Death by Elisheva Baumgarten in our first meeting. And I think it's an important track to continue going down as you give us even further background by saying what were the economic activities that Jews were permitted to partake in, both before the Black Death and after it. So that's one question which I would like to pose to you. In parallel, we've had a question also taking a broader gaze regarding citizenship. So Aviya, you mentioned when you were talking about the decision of the city council, and you had the word citizens in the primary source, and the question was raised whether the word citizen is in the modern sense, which would have several implications which we can think about, or whether you're using it in a different medieval sense. And we'd love to hear the answer to that. Another thing which I think came up very interestingly in your talks is how we get at the past. I saw several interesting types of sources. So you were using maps, you're using city council decisions, you're using court documents, you're using the taxes, the Paris tie. And if you want to expand a little about how the types of documents which you look at give a different sense of the Middle Ages and into your economic questions. We also have another question. If you survive the Black Death and you manage to benefit economically, could all this be an incentive for getting the economy running again? And before I bombard you with any of the more wonderful questions which are coming in, please give your short answers to each of those three questions, and then we'll continue on collecting and
So I think I'll begin with the question on citizenship, which is a very big topic, and there's a lot of scholarship dedicated to what does citizenship, and particularly Jewish citizenship, mean in the medieval city. In this sense, I'm trying, for today's talk, I tried to talk about it in a very narrow sense of a certain agreement allowing people to reside in a city and also meaning that they hold tax obligations to that city and are under the communal protection of whatever ruler is placed in that city. But there are different citizenship rights for different groups and different implications that came along with these citizenships. So it's a much more particular type of citizenship than what we would be talking about in the Middle Ages, and in the modern sense, excuse me. And just to continue from that, I'll give my answer, and I'm sure Nureet will want to expand more about that, the question of what occupations were Jews permitted or not to do. We have so much evidence of Jewish money lending, and that is probably related to the fact that money lending required some form of document, in many cases, to be drawn up because it is not an immediate transaction, meaning that it is probably highly overrepresented in historical evidence as the main economic pursuit. And we do have evidence of Jews actually active in many other fields in the economy. Nureet's tax lists have wonderful examples, which she'll expand about, on different professions that the Jews held. But also in Germany, there are many cases of Jews in crafts and in other forms of the economy beyond money lending.
Yes, thank you. So I'll just add to that, that one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by the tax list is exactly that. They give us such a broader idea of what Jews did, what occupations they held. And the fact that they list the occupations of the inhabitants of Paris showed us the variety of occupations of Jews, and I have to say of men as well as women, because we have many women, many Jewish women listed as head of households. And for examples, we have teachers, and we have silk sewers, we have flour sellers, and many, many other occupations. It's very interesting to see. And I have to give one more example. There is another source from mid-13th century, which is called the Book of Professions, that wrote Etienne Bilon. He was head of the guilds. He was responsible of listing all the guilds of Paris. And there we find something interesting. There is one example of a law in one certain silk guild that states that the apprentices must not go to Jewish women in order to learn the profession. Now, on the one hand, we can say, okay, so this means that there weren't Jews who did this. But on the other hand, this exactly means that there were indeed people who, Christian apprentices, who came to Jewish women to learn this profession. So this is another example. And Neta, I think this connects me to your third question about the sources, the type of documents. So I think this is the beauty of history. There are so many documents that can help us complete the picture. We will never know exactly the specific picture. If I'm looking at the economy, it's really difficult to see. And I think we saw, in last weeks, we saw several other documents, Hebrew sources, that also help us see the complete picture. But the administrative documents give us the prism of the non-Jews on the Jewish place in economy and in society. And I think this is the uniqueness of these kinds of sources. I think I answered the questions. Did I miss anything?
No, you're wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. There are other questions which have come in which connect right onto what you've been speaking about. So one of the things which Aviya mentioned was how the violence ensued in the power vacuum. So once the king was away for the coronation in Aachen, there was violence towards the Jews. And interestingly, you mentioned how this power vacuum and the horrible pogrom against the Jews of Frankfurt occurred even before the plague as a disease, as a disease that was harming people inside the city, arrived into the urban environs. And when the question which was written was, were there other waves of influence which caused turmoil in Frankfurt before the plague hit it as a disease? So whether looking at the question from an economic perspective means that were actually things which were already being overturned in Frankfurt before the plague hit it, which was the result of the fact that the plague had already affected other areas, I think south of Frankfurt, but you would have to correct me if I'm wrong. And the other question which connects to what happened in such cases. So someone asked about other foreign groups. You mentioned that there were other strangers and other foreigners. So firstly, could you tell us who these other foreigners were? And secondly, what happened to them? Once the plagues came to the city, once there were violent outbursts against the Jews before or after the arrival of the plague, were there other groups which were affected, and were they affected in similar or different ways? So I would say the first question to Aviya, and maybe the second if you would like to take it, Nureet, and any other order is fine with us as well. We're being quite democratic about it.
Okay, so I'll jump in again, and I'll say that these power dynamics and power vacuums are a dynamic that happen in many cities in the German Empire. This is by no means my research. This is research that has been done by many distinguished scholars and Professor Alfred Havelkamp from Trier, who looked at the dynamics of the city council and different authorities in the city and how they played out and determined what was happening to the city's Jews. Now, specifically in Frankfurt, of course, that the fact that the plague hit in Southern Europe much earlier meant that they had time to prepare in a way, and preparation also was with the information that was coming in as to what was about to happen. And this is also something I've learned from a dear colleague, Dr. Tzafrir Barzilai, who wrote about the spread of well poisoning accusations and how cities became informed from one another, and not only about the fact that the plague was coming, but also with the methods in which they were trying to maybe remedy and to protect themselves against the plague. And this was also the case in Frankfurt, where they were getting information from other cities also about the persecution of the Jews, and also about these rumors of the fact that the Jews had poisoned the wells, causing the mortality. To the second question, I think this is really something Nureet can attest to much better about the different foreigners, but these were also similar foreigners that would also that were also present in Germany.
Thank you. Over to you, Nureet, and then we'll have time for a final question before we part ways for this evening.
Okay, so try to make this short. First of all, again, that wonderful tax list, they are arranged by the city street. And at the end, I found there are many different distinguished minorities. So besides the Jews, we can see the Lombards, which were Italian merchants that were also in the city of Paris. They lived very close to the Jews in the main central places, and they are also listed separately. Also, we have reverends that were there, and I also can tell you that there are dead people who are listed there. This is not a minority, but this is just an interesting anecdote that if you died, it doesn't mean that you didn't have to pay the tax. And just to throw in just one more thing of larger perspective, we know that in the beginning of the century, the Templars, who were very close to the king, to Philippe le Bel, a couple of years before the Jews were expelled, the Templars were executed in the middle of Paris. So they were also persecuted for other reasons, for political reasons, for economic reasons, but there are many minorities or other groups that at times were not belonging to the city or to the strata of society. So this is one thing that I wanted to answer. And I forgot the second part. Maybe I'll.
No, that was a question, whether there was organized persecution against different minority groups other than the Jews.
Oh, yes.
And so we'll go to a final question. Anyone who's kind of been listening from the beginning knows that everyone who's speaking in this series is part of the ERC group Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe, and that everyone who's been contributing from their research looks at kind of micro bits of daily life, even of specific people. We met Benoit in Nureet's talk and other individuals, which both of them have been following. But actually the question we're going to be finishing with today is a macro question. It's been asked that maybe because Jews in the Middle Ages in Europe lived within empires, or maybe the globalism of the time, and they continued suffered due or not due to the Black Plague. Do these facts, asks the question, provide more evidence that globalism, whether then or now, is maybe a means to discriminate and persecute? It may be outside the scope of your individual research, but I think we've all been playing around the micro and the macro, the then and the now. So maybe the question is actually a good point to finish, and maybe even a teaser to next week's conversation. So if either of you would like to tackle that large economic question, then I dare you.
So I'll jump and answer something, which is, this is not a new thing. The globalization, we can call it this way or another, but the economy was also always in some point, in some way, globalized. People came from one place to another. I just I have to say, for example, just in Tractate Ta'anit, I just learned that yesterday, and I felt like it's so very important it is for the 14th century. Then when it speaks about the plague, and there it says that there is a danger that if we hear that there is a plague in some other city, then we must make a ta'anit here. And they question why is it so far away? And it says, because merchants will come and they will bring with them the plague. So we must prepare now, and thus we see that this is not a new thing. The globalization and the effect of economy and global economy on plagues and on society. This is just.
Well, I don't think there's much I can add to such a beautiful answer. I'll say just in the issue of minorities, I think you can see that within this process, the attitude towards minorities is, I don't think it was used as, globalization wasn't used as an excuse, but it was definitely perhaps within such a global environment that allowed people to look at others in different ways. But as we saw in the example of the Jews, what does their otherness mean? These could have been people who were born in the city, who lived in the city, who paid taxes in the city. And we remain to ask, what does being an outsider in a medieval city actually mean?
Thank you very, very much to both of you. And I turn back to Tamar and thank again Beit Avichai for allowing us to speak and think about these issues all together. Thank you very much to our speakers.